Welcome to Arpin Group's International Insights and part 2 of our 4-part micro-series that's focusing on COVID-19 and how it's affecting the global relocation industry. I'm Linda Casey, and in part 2 we're going to learn about cross-border travel, domestic travel, and how they're being applied by different regions around the world. Joining us to provide their insight is our international panel who truly have the pulse on the industry, and they are representing Ireland and the United Kingdom, Keith Whelan, Arpin International Group's Managing Director, Ireland. Representing Germany and the mainland EU, Sebastian Sommer, Arpin International Group's Managing Director, Germany. Representing the Middle East and India, Lauren Inglis, Arpin International Group's Regional Director of the Middle East and India. Representing Singapore and Australia, Michael Johnson, Arpin International Group's Vice President, Asia Pacific Region. Representing China, Michael Hughes, Arpin Group's Vice President, Global Business Development. And rounding off our panel from the United States is host and moderator Jim Esposito, Arpin Group's Vice President, Global Strategy. Jim, take it away.
Keith, I wanted to ask, we started out with Ireland, and I wanted to ask you if there's any border closures. Are they restricting people coming in? What are the restrictions as far as travel and people entering Ireland?
Well, like what the guys were saying there, there's more restrictions on travel internally than there is between the borders or internationally. At no stage did Ireland close their borders for people travelling in and travelling out. What they've tried to do is to try to restrict what people do when they arrive. So under current rules, when you arrive in Ireland, you have to isolate for 14 days, restrict your movement around and keep yourself at home or at your final destination until the 14-day period has expired. Now they're working towards a situation where they might bring in something like it's been in other European countries where you get to have a test, get a clear result, either before or just after you arrive, and then one a couple of days later. But that's only going through at the moment. They're only discussing it. The only real clear sort of restriction or requirement for people is you must complete a passenger locator form before you come to Ireland. And it's actually deemed an offence if you don't. And if you arrive at the border without one, you can be fined. So you go online before you arrive, complete the form, give the information about where you're coming from, where you've been for 2 weeks, and where you intend to go to for 2 weeks. And you provide your contact information. I travel a lot between the UK and Ireland previous to the COVID-19. And I've recently traveled over to Ireland and completed the 14-day isolation period. And from that experience, you do get contacted, you do get a phone call, you do get text messages, you do get regular contact advising you about medical advice, where you can seek help if you need help, and just to remind you of your responsibilities. I touched on earlier on that they've increased our restrictions to level 3, and what level 3 does internally is it keeps people ideally working from home if they can. It also stops people from going to restaurants and moving around, so there's an internal movement restriction. But also you can't leave your county, so unless you have to go for school or for work. So police are visibly on checkpoints around the country. There's 132 checkpoints today. There was restrictions in Dublin where police are just asking you where to go. And even though they haven't got the authority to actually send you home, they'll encourage you to go home. And I suppose they use the Irish way of actually kind of check your tires if you don't turn around. So there are ways to encourage people to comply if they don't, but people are generally willing to do so. In terms of customs have generally moved a lot of the services that was manual online. So you can do a transfer of residence clearance online where you wouldn't have previously been able to do that. So the IT, the whole working from home thing has moved into government departments too. And that's kind of made a smoother transition and a smoother opportunity for people to deal with customs clearances as effectively as you would have previously, and probably even more efficiently, because before you were actually manually going down with original customs forms to the customs house, collecting the clearance documents and coming back. So it's improved the situation in that way.
Interesting. You mentioned quarantine. Is that required for any incoming passenger?
Yeah, and the only place you can travel into Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, the south of Ireland, is from Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland obviously is part of the UK. But there's free travel between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland. And a lot of people live on the border, so there's a lot of people that might live in the Republic of Ireland and work in Northern Ireland and vice versa. So they've tried to keep those restrictions down to a minimum. Obviously, there's other Brexit things on the horizon that might affect that. But for now, COVID-wise, there's free movement between the UK and Ireland, just at Northern Ireland. But yeah, even though we've had a historical relationship with Great Britain about the free movement of people, that's all superseded. And even amongst the countries of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the UK, or England, I should say, they're actually in the process of possibly having local internal border points and restrictions of travel between, say, Wales and England, based on the cases per 100,000.
Very interesting. Well, the same question, more or less, to you, Sebastian, about Germany. What's going on there? Any border restrictions?
Yes, so interestingly enough, after the initial border closure ended in June, no border were closed again, and they changed their strategy now, and they announcing risk areas in other European countries, on other countries, and if you travel to one of these areas, you have to quarantine if you're returning. But for example, if we have a move from one risk area to Germany, the assignee would need to quarantine or get tested negatively before we can deliver the shipment as well. What's interesting is that our crew can go to the region and pack the shipment, and they can stay in this risk area for 72 hours. And they do not need to do anything. They have no restrictions if they return within the 72 hours. And they could deliver the shipment straight away, but they can't because the assignee needs to be quarantined or get tested, and this takes some days as well. So that's an complexity we have to work around during the next month. And we have some solutions in place, and we had some discussions with the assignees. And for one, for example, the spouse traveled to the destination earlier, so we were able to deliver straight away, and they could quarantine together afterwards. Or we have to store the shipment in the meantime, or the relocation company needs to be present at the origin or destination. So that's something we have to work around going forward. But no borders closed. But there's no real travel for tourism anymore because nobody wants to go on vacation and return and need to go into quarantine for certain days.
For 30 days?
For certain days, sorry.
Okay, I misheard you. Wow, thanks for clearing that up. Lauren, how about in the UAE?
Well, from the 2nd of June, actually, the Emirates of Abu Dhabi decided that they were going to impose a separate lockdown to Dubai, the rest of the Emirates. And it was very interesting because over here, generally when the UAE government makes a decision, the decision is usually made in Abu Dhabi and all other Emirates comply. So the take on the Abu Dhabi lockdown, it's gone on a lot longer than what anybody expected or anticipated. And it's made it very, very difficult for a lot of businesses and a lot of workers who are living in other Emirates to travel in and out of Abu Dhabi. And the restrictions are basically that if they want to go in or out of Abu Dhabi, they need to, when they hit the border, they need to be able to provide a negative COVID test that was done within 48 hours of their arrival or their exit. So, I mean, definitely it's gone on a lot longer than what we thought, but what it has done on the moving side of things as well is it's actually allowed a lot of other movers in the UAE to communicate with one another, moving companies here in Dubai that have offices in Abu Dhabi are able to offer services to people who actually do moves in Abu Dhabi but don't have physical crew there. So that's been a really positive way of kind of getting the moving community to come together, I think.
Oh,
It's
thank you.
interesting, Lauren. Actually, that kind of reminds me of a very unfortunate other time. After 9/11 in New York City, everybody was nice to each other for a period of time. And,
well, yes, that's exactly it. Everyone's like, once COVID's over, it's going to go back to being how it was. But for the time being, let's all help each other to try and get through this mess.
exactly.
Well, I got to disagree with the man from New Jersey that we New Yorkers are still very nice people.
Well,
He,
speak for
he
yourself.
only says that because he's from Jersey. Mr. Hughes.
Yeah,
Okay.
so for restrictions about domestic or international, if we look at the domestic situation first, there is free travel within China, specifically mainland China. And what that looks like is for all the residents locally here, including expatriates, we have a QR code that is linked to our cell phones. And whatever location or province we go to, when we cross into that, we can scan a QR code at the entry exit points. And that way it's able to track your location. So the good side of that is your QR code should be highlighted in red, highlighted in green. And depending on the locations that you go to, if you come to any area where they do find COVID cases, that QR code will actually automatically change from green to orange to yellow to red. And when that happens, you are restricted on where you can actually go. So domestically, it's okay to travel. This is different for families. So especially for expatriates that do have families, young children in school, there are requirements specifically for Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Chengdu as well, that if you do have children and they are in schools, they are not allowed to travel during the public holidays. So for example, right now is a week-long holiday in China. It's the national holiday, very similar to July 4th in the US, except we've got a week to celebrate. And during this period, every family that has children in schools were told that they're not allowed to go outside of their city district, because if they do, they have to complete a 14-day quarantine. And that way, to try to ensure that children, when they're traveling with their parents across the country, seeing family, going back to hometowns, etc., that they're not potentially bringing the virus back. So domestically, it's controlled in the sense of they know where the hotspots are, and if you come even close to a hotspot, your QR code will alert you. And also, once you have that change in the color of your QR code, then you'd be restricted on where you can. Most public places won't allow you in. For example, Disney resorts who are there over the weekend, they check your QR code, and if it's not green, they won't let you in through the parking lot. So it's a very, very strict process from that side. From an international perspective, we are seeing changes in the positive direction. So China had closed its borders pretty much for several months now, actually. And just by the end of September, they made an announcement that they will be reopening their borders to expatriates coming into the country. Now, this is a very, very significant change, because previously, when they closed the border, they stated that anybody who would want to come into China after that closure has to reapply for a new visa. Their current visa is no longer valid. And that process for reapplication is very complex. It includes things like getting signatures from local municipalities, what they're calling locally is a PU letter, or an endorsement from your embassy. It's a very stringent policy to actually even get approval to get a visa to come back in. So now they've done away with that, thankfully. So those who do have existing visas are allowed to come back in. However, there is a still enforced mandatory 14-day quarantine. And this is not a quarantine at home. This is a quarantine at a government-sponsored hotel that you have to isolate in for 14 days. Literally, they pick you up at the airport. Once you get to the hotel, they check you in, and you do not leave that room for 14 days. For any child under 18 years old, they are allowed to stay with one of the adults. However, even married couples, etc., they would be split up, and each of them would be going through the quarantine by themselves. This also is in addition, before you can even get on a plane to come into China, you have to have a COVID test done, and you have to have the negative results before you can even board onto the plane. And in order to help to enforce and motivate companies, especially airlines, to adhere to this policy, China has been doing a grading system, if you'd like to call that. And what it is for any flights coming in, as soon as you land, you're retested. And if your percentage of passengers goes above a certain mark that are testing positive for COVID, China will suspend those airlines for the next 30 days or next. It depends on where they're coming from, but they will suspend it for a duration. So most of the airlines are helping and supporting to be compliant to make sure that any passenger has that negative test before they even get on, because in the end, it's going to affect their business.
Very interesting approach. Wow. Just a general question, follow up. On the domestic travel with the, what'd you call it? What's the
QR code. So
the QR code.
Think of a cereal box. Yeah.
If you go into an area green and it turns yellow or red and you're already in that area, what's the impact?
Well, that's actually a really good question. And a short story is we went to a trip near Inner Mongolia, or to the Gobi Desert. And this is the area that borders Mongolia. It also comes very close in certain parts to Russia as well. And there was a joke when we were with the tour guide. He said his last group that they went too close to the border, and the cellular connection switched to the international one for Russia. And immediately their QR code changed because it showed that they left the country. So everyone's turning off their phones and turning the power off so they don't get caught. However, I mean, it's unlikely because the news is reporting all the areas. So actually, even when we were traveling to that period, we had mapped out every single area where there was cases found, and we completely avoided those cities. And as for a foreigner myself, I was not allowed to enter. So when we arrived to the first destination city, we were actually advised, because of the hotels that you can stay in, it is limited to what hotel foreigners are allowed to stay in because of the situation now. And when we checked in, they did advise us, because it's common tourist areas. And they said, well, for this area, there are suspect cases, or they are confirmed cases. For foreigners, they wouldn't be allowed to get into that city. So even if you're trying to get a train ticket to go in, or even if you take a private car, and which we did, we were stopped at the border going into the different provinces, and we all had to get out of the car. We had to get checked by the police, show the passport, show the QR code, and all those kind of things. So they are very strict, and it's very difficult to, if you're adhering to the policies and regulations, to make a mistake and run the risk of getting your QR code changed to either orange or yellow, and hopefully not red.
Wow, very interesting. Mr. Johnson.
Yep. Well, Singapore being a city state, right, is probably a little bit easier to control. But in fact, anyone who is not a permanent resident or a returning Singapore citizen, as was mentioned in China, has to go into a government mandated hotel, not of your choice. So that's part of the fun lottery, because some people have been posting on Instagram that I got the W hotel, because they're all the same price, and it's about 2,000 Singapore dollars apparently for 14 days, but you've got to stay in there for 14 days, no getting out. So that's very strict. If you are a permanent resident or a Singapore citizen returning, and both of those situations do pertain to moves, by the way, often, most likely, you'll be quarantined at home with a bracelet mandated by the government to be worn for those 14 days. And they do spot checks at the hotel and at the residence. So once again, just to mention that Singapore is extremely strict about it. But just to touch on domestic tourism, it being a city, domestic tourism's encouraged, obviously, to stimulate the economy, which is something else we'd probably get into. And everything from staycations, which we're all getting used to now, staying in hotels in our backyard.
So true.
What they call daycations, where you can go to a hotel and use the facilities, such as the restaurants and the swimming pools, and you pay for a kind of day rate, but you don't use the room. So they're getting creative about how they work within the economy too, to stimulate that.
It's excellent. Well, thank you, folks. So far, this has been very informative.
From strict border entry to mandatory hotel quarantines for non-residents, all the way to using QR codes with mobile apps, there are a variety of things in play when it comes to trying to control COVID in different countries, as we learned. Hopefully, our panel gave you a good sense of what to expect. The one takeaway I came away with is the need to prepare in advance by checking online what the expectations are for the countries you plan on traveling to. As Keith Whelan made reference to, in some cases, if you come unprepared, you could end up being fined, along with not being allowed in. Definitely not a situation you want to find yourself in. In part 3 of our 4-part series, we'll look at how COVID-19 is affecting clients and how they're dealing with it, and what we in the industry are doing to help them through it. You can click the link to begin watching.